Hello, welcome to week 3 video lectures. I'm going to provide 2 video lectures this week. The first on Crevecoeur and what is an American, and the second, and it will include the Articles of Confederation. The second is on the Constitutional Convention and then the Revolution of 1800. Now, before I get to Crevecoeur, I do want to touch upon the idea of natural rights. Now, the philosophers, the Enlightenment, put forth this idea of natural rights, or rights that are given to us by God or by nature. They are not given to us by a government. And this is key because if the government gives you rights, then the government can take away those rights. What the Enlightenment thinkers were proposing was that these rights were natural, that they were absolute, that they could not be taken away, that they were inalienable. And if these rights are inalienable and they cannot be taken away by a government, again, they are absolute and we all enjoy them. Now, of course, you could look at the hypocrisy of they didn't provide. We look at natural rights, they go to everybody, but of course we denied them to some, and that's obviously a legitimate argument. But again, this idea is completely different, and you can tell how this would revolutionize philosophy and the ideas that would come after this, because if people control their own destiny, if these rights are absolute, they're given to us by nature or by God, they cannot be taken away by the government. This provides obviously a new level of freedom. So let's go to What is an American? Hector St. John Crevecoeur, his essay written in 1782. Crevecoeur was a French writer who came to the United States. He traveled it to garner a better understanding of the new nation and its people. What did he find? This was contained in his Letters from an American Farmer, which reads very much like an advertisement for the New World. But the essay, What is an American, has earned him the largest reading audience and gained him the most attention, more than anything else he did. So what is an American, according to this Frenchman? He stresses pluralism in all avenues, a mix of nationalities, religions, regional differences. Americans are traders, Traders. They're manufacturers, they're farmers, the whole gamut of economic opportunity. Now, major characteristics which define the American, he practices self-interest, individualism. He shows industry, works hard. The nation finds unity through the diversity that it enjoys. There are folks from all different countries, practicing different religions, and practicing different professions. Crevecoeur's analysis is important in understanding what an American was in 1782, significantly because this is a European who is making the analysis, not an American spreading propaganda. And Crevecoeur's answer to this question, his description of being an American, would dominate really throughout our nation's history. 2 of his famous dictates: each person works for himself. And then my favorite, his labor is founded on the basis of nature, self-interest. Self-interest is nature. Now, wrap your head around that, take whatever time you need to, pause the video, but nature is self-interest and our self-interest is nature. But again, what he's looking at is the idea of self-reliance as well through this individualism. Now, consider other important American thinkers who also espouse these ideals. First and foremost, of course, would be Thomas Jefferson, who idealized the U.S. as a haven for the yeoman farmer, for the rugged individual who could rely on himself to take care of his family and his dependents. Jefferson eschewed the idea of urbanization and the upcoming transition to manufacturing, which we'll talk about next week. He believed in the independent American farmer as the backbone of the country. Self-reliance and individualism were essential to this ideal. We also see the idea of self-reliance in the writings of Ralph Waldo Emerson, who idealized this concept and spread it even further. Americans could not only provide for themselves materially, they were intellectually capable of understanding modern thought and practicing it. They were on the same level as Europeans or any of these philosophers. Thus, the average American did not need a nanny state holding its hand, but she could take care of themselves, be active civically and politically, and help to steer the nation on the proper course. Americans did not need an emperor or a king or a queen or a dictator to lead them. They could lead themselves. Now, Crevecoeur was somewhat idealistic, obviously, but his description cannot be discounted. And again, many of these ideals are what we see as the foundation of our Constitution. Before we get to the Constitution, let's talk about the Articles of Confederation. Now, what were the Articles of Confederation about? This was a way to establish the government and systems in the new nation. The focus was on states' rights. In short, the citizens of the new nation did not want to create an opportunity for the government to turn into what they had fought against in the Revolution. Thus, this was created out of reaction in some ways, but understandably so. Again, think about what the Declaration of Independence states. And so this was the goal of the Articles, again, to avoid becoming what Britain had become. Now, what was the weakness of the Articles? Oh, there were many. Defense. For example, southern states had to deal with Native Americans that were supported by the Spanish, and the individual states could not fully defend themselves on their own. Because of the theoretical equality of the states, each state was left to its own devices. Now, this was not good for smaller states who often had to pay higher levies to bigger states for necessary goods. We have regionalism. People considered themselves Virginians or Pennsylvanians rather than Americans, because again, the focus here is on the state. And if you have no national military to defend your state, again, you are going to fall victim. And so this was a problem. Again, no national military because of no true national unity, and then that leaves no diplomacy with other nation states, which then would lead to little recognition by these foreign powers, and that's important for a new nation. Just ask the Soviet Union. No national finance system, no ability to raise taxes or regulate commerce, thus there were no national coffers. And remember, we had paid these exorbitant taxes to the British, and our nation had then fought this revolution, partially because of that, and we had expenses, and we could no longer pay them, because we did not have these national coffers. So after experiencing the tyranny of a strong centralized government while under the thumb of the English crown, the founding fathers wanted to avoid such government power in the new nation, and may have overcompensated with the establishment of the Articles of Confederation. May have. And it was just as it sounds, a government for a confederation of states rather than a government for one country. This would turn out to be problematic. Now, this would continue to be a problem even after the failure of the Articles. There was no immediate embrace of a strong centralized government, and honestly, this could be considered an issue today. Think about the two major political parties and their claims and actions. And when we talk about Federalists and Anti-Federalists, this will become even clearer. Democrats espouse a strong centralized government and believe people need to be guided. Republicans, theoretically, I would say conservatives, really not Republicans, believe a limited central government is the way to go, that the people should be able to render their own decisions, and that any need for government should come at the state and local level. In the Articles, the states were the centerpiece. In the Constitution, the country was the focus. But again, think back to Jefferson, to Emerson, to Crevecoeur, these ideas on self-reliance. This was kind of a major question with regard to the Constitution. So the Articles would fail. There are calls for a new convention, and we're going to talk about the Constitutional Convention in the next video lecture. But first, I want to touch upon the idea of compromise and some of the issues that we would see developing early in the nation. Now, key to the early years, and really throughout our existence, is the idea of compromise. I had a colleague when I was an undergraduate who argued that the history of the United States is the history of compromise, and truly one can make that argument. We see it in many ways. We see it just in the formation of the Articles. We see it in the Constitutional Convention itself. There were disagreements on how the government should be structured, who should lead, how much power a federal government should have, and just how to bring freedom, democracy, and equality to this new world. During a contentious convention, two groups would separate themselves: Federalists and what were called Anti-Federalists. The names are kind of misleading. Federalists wanted a strong central government. Now, obviously, if you think of federalism, you think of a collection of states, right? Whatever. They came up with the term because they wanted to paint the Anti-Federalists as negative. So let's get back to it. Federalists wanted a strong central government similar to England, only without the crown. Alexander Hamilton and John Adams were on this side, and they were prodded by a guy named George Washington. Now, Hamilton very much espoused the English formation, and honestly, Hamilton would have gone with a crown or a king if he would have had his way. It's kind of one of the ironies of him being a founding father. Anti-Federalists, on the other hand, wanted states' rights. They wanted less power in the federal government. They liked the Articles of Confederation in many ways and only wanted to amend it. The Federalists won out, but not without some compromise. The ideal of a balance of power, or checks and balances, This would come out. The Anti-Federalists would push for a Bill of Rights, which focused on personal liberty and specifically restriction of federal power. The Federalists begrudgingly granted this in order to get the Constitution approved. But there was another compromise, which I'm going to talk about in a minute. But when you think about the Bill of Rights, think about that. That was about personal liberty, and that was key to the Anti-Federalists. The Federalists, they passed it because they needed the Constitution to be approved. And I would ask each of you to read the 10th Amendment to the Constitution on your own. Now, this other compromise, of course, is about slavery. Many people ask, why was slavery not ended with the Constitution? As obviously there is some hypocrisy involved when you're stating all people are free and equal, but then you deny these rights to African Americans and, of course, to women. But the only way to get the Constitution approved and thus allow for the creation of this new nation was to allow slavery to continue. Without it, the Southern colonies would not have approved the Constitution. Many wanted it out at the time, those in the North and those in the South, including Thomas Jefferson, but it was not yet feasible. This represents one failure of the time and theoretically a downside to compromise. But without it, who knows where we would be? Would we have had a federation of states, as the Confederacy attempted in 1861? More importantly, many would argue the nation never would have even gotten off the ground because this would not have been approved. So compromise is essential, and it does have its weaknesses, obviously. Now, we'll come back. We'll talk about the Constitutional Convention and the Revolution of 1800.